People born in Britain just before and during the stretch of wartime sugar rationing went on to develop dementia at a 21% lower rate than people born only a few years later, once sugar was freely available again. That is the finding of a new study published July 29, 2026, in the medical journal Neurology, built on health records from over 60,000 people in the UK Biobank. Sugar rationing began during World War II and did not fully end in Britain until 1953, which accidentally created something researchers rarely get to study directly: a large, government-enforced natural experiment in early life diet, with a hard cut-off date instead of people simply choosing to eat less sugar. Researchers compared people whose first 1 to 2 years of life fell before that cut-off against people born just after it, and found the rationed group also developed dementia an average of 2.6 years later in life, on top of the lower overall rate. Before you go cutting sugar out of your own diet expecting the same result, let us sort the signal from the noise. Scientists studying nutrition almost never get a clean test of cause and effect, because people who eat less sugar by choice also tend to differ in dozens of other ways: income, education, exercise, access to healthcare, all of which could independently affect dementia risk decades later. Sugar rationing sidesteps that problem in a way voluntary diet studies cannot. It was imposed by the British government on the entire population regardless of income or preference. Sugar became widely available again in September 1953, and the UK Biobank happens to contain health data on hundreds of thousands of people born on both sides of that date. That gives researchers something close to a randomized experiment without ever having to run one. One large group had sugar intake capped by policy during their first year or two of life. The next group, born shortly after, did not, and every other major life circumstance stayed roughly similar between them. Researchers tracked both groups for decades afterward, comparing not just whether they developed dementia, but at what age, and what their brain scans looked like when they did. The dementia numbers were not the only finding. Researchers also examined brain imaging from the same participants and found physical differences that lined up with the rationing exposure. People who had lower sugar exposure in their first year or two of life showed greater total gray matter volume later in life. Gray matter being the brain tissue most associated with memory, reasoning, and processing, along with fewer white matter hyperintensities, small bright spots that show up on brain scans and are a recognized marker of small vessel damage inside the brain, generally considered a bad sign for long-term brain health. Extending the rationing window from age 1 to age 2 increased the protective effect slightly, to a 23% lower dementia risk. Together, the dementia rates, the age of onset delay, and the brain scan differences form a consistent picture rather than one isolated statistic, which is part of why researchers are treating this natural experiment as unusually credible evidence. Even though, like any observational study, it cannot fully prove that sugar itself, rather than something correlated with it, caused the difference. Researchers have a plausible biological reason to think early life sugar exposure could matter more than sugar eaten later on. The first 1 to 2 years of life are when the brain is laying down an enormous share of its lifetime vascular architecture, the blood vessels that will feed brain tissue for the next 80 or 90 years. Alongside rapid neural growth, high early sugar intake is linked in other research to poorer blood vessel health and insulin regulation, and the white matter damage seen in this study's brain scans is specifically the kind of injury associated with small blood vessel problems built up over decades. If early sugar exposure nudges that foundational vascular development in a worse direction, the effects could plausibly compound quietly for most of a lifetime before showing up as dementia in someone's 70s or 80s. This is sometimes called a developmental programming effect. The idea that conditions in infancy can set a trajectory that persists long after the original exposure ends. It is a real hypothesis with biological grounding, not just a coincidence found by data mining a large database. Here is the real limitation. And it matters. Sugar rationing during World War II did not just limit sugar. Wartime Britain also changed food availability broadly, restricted meat and fats, encouraged home vegetable growing, and came with different overall activity levels, stress patterns, and breastfeeding norms than the years right after the war. The natural experiment design controls for income and voluntary choice far better than an ordinary diet study, but it cannot fully isolate sugar from every other wartime condition that shifted at roughly the same time. The UK Biobank itself also carries a well-known bias. Its participants are generally healthier and better off than the general population, because healthier people are more likely to volunteer for a long-term health study in the first place, which can shift results in ways that are hard to fully correct for. And critically, this is a story about exposure in the first 1 to 2 years of life. It says nothing about whether cutting sugar as an adult, decades after that window closed, would meaningfully change your own dementia risk today. That is a different question this study was not designed to answer. Quick recap. A new study in Neurology used Britain's wartime sugar rationing as a natural experiment and found that people with less sugar exposure in their first 1 to 2 years of life had a 21 to 23% lower risk of dementia decades later, developed it later when they did get it, and showed healthier brain scans, more gray matter, fewer signs of small vessel damage. So, signal or noise, leaning signal. This is a genuinely strong study design. A policy-driven natural experiment is about as close as nutrition science gets to a randomized trial. And the results line up across 3 separate measures instead of resting on one number. But it is still an observational study riding on a chaotic wartime period with many moving variables. And it tells you about exposure in infancy, not about your sugar habits today. The honest headline is not cut your sugar and dodge dementia. It is that what a brain is fed in its first 2 years may matter for it decades longer than anyone assumed. Subscribe for the research that actually explains your risks, not just the studies that trend. Signal from the noise. Every week.